Hey guys, it's me back to you today with another video, and today I want to talk about the fact that I really wish that Stephen Sommers would have gone and went with his original script version for the Mummy movie from the year 1999, which was a remake of the black and white 1932 Boris Karloff Mummy movie. And if you're interested, and I really highly suggest and hope that you all go and read the article after seeing this video, because I cannot even remember everything that even was in the article, and it's a Screen Rant article, and all you have to type in, and hell, I'll even put the link in the description below and pin the comment to the top of the article that I read, and I read it over and over and over because not only do I find it very interesting and fascinating, but also in a way kind of painful, because it's kind of like something that could have happened and honestly, if anything, should have, but sadly did not. And if he had even gone with his original version or script for his 1999 Mummy movie, which I personally think would have been much more greater and better than compared to the version of that movie of his that we ended up getting in reality, unfortunately, or instead. And on the article on Screen Rant, it just simply says everything that changed from the original script of the 1999 Mummy movie. And honestly, I think the article is very amazing. And if you have the chance and have the time, I suggest you all read it. And I mean, I think it's an incredible article, but I guess that's just the way I feel. But obviously, you all can make up your mind on your own after like reading it, if you do. And I mean, when I read it, I, in a way, was kind of upset and disappointed because when I was reading the article, and honest to God, I didn't even know that there was even an original like script or like version or take on his Mummy movie from 1999. I had no idea or clue that there was a much more darker take on his version of the movie if he would have went with his original darker take on the movie, which would have had like gore and blood, probably more profanity, and obviously this would have all resulted in ultimately having to have a higher rating, which I would not have minded one bit. I mean, seriously, that wouldn't have bothered me one bit. I would have loved it if Stephen Sommers' 1999 Mummy movie, the remake of the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff Mummy movie, if it would have actually been a spiritual successor to that movie, I mean, I would have been so thankful and grateful. And for fans who are in, for people and like fans or whatever who are into more like horror movies and like darker takes on movies or whatever, it's even more disappointing and upsetting for us knowing that we could have easily gotten a much darker take on Stephen Sommers' Mummy movie from 1999, which would have been so fucking dope. I mean, there's no question about it. It would have been just fantastic. Even just by reading the article alone, I can just tell, man, this movie would have been so much better than what we ended up getting instead, and the reality of things. And, you know, I don't know. I'm personally just left kind of crushed and heartbroken about it, even though I know it's just a movie and it's not that big of a deal or whatever. And you can make that argument and point, fair enough. But at the same time, like, we haven't really had like an actual like horrific mummy movie, at least not yet anyways. We haven't had like an actual spiritual successor to Boris Karloff's 1932 black and white classic, which for back then in the early 1930s, that was like the darkest take on that character or story or whatever that you could have possibly gotten back then. but also back then things weren't as like violent and brutal and dark and horrifying. And obviously there wasn't really even like profanity back then, and a lot of movies had like lower ratings back in the day. Like back then, especially in like black and white movies, there was a lot less swearing. I mean, it was pretty rare for a movie back then in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s to have like an R rating, or like an extreme amount of like blood or gore, or whatever. And I would say that stuff didn't start happening at least until like the 1970s. Even in the 1960s, movies still, even then, weren't like that violent or bloody or gory, even for the more higher rated movies. And also, not to mention, it was, even in the 1960s, it was still kind of rare for a movie to receive an R rating. Let's see. And PG-13, that rating didn't exist back then. It didn't exist until like the late 80s. And let's see what else. Yeah, so for the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff mummy movie, classic Universal monster mummy movie, that was as dark as you could get it for back then. But I mean, knowing that it got remade in the late 90s and early 2000s, it's like, I mean, we just, honest to God, should have gotten an actual spiritual horror successor to that old black and white classic version of the Mummy movie. But sadly, we didn't, which in a way is kind of heartbreaking, especially for die-hard horror fans like myself. And what's even more annoying is the fact that there were a lot of other directors who even planned to make an actual spiritual horror successor Mummy movie remake to the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff movie. Like Clive Barker was going to make a Mummy movie. George A. Romero, who made a bunch of like zombie movies in like the 80s and 90s and shit like that, he was a run-up to direct a Mummy movie. And Joe Dante, or I think his name is Joe Dante or something like that, he was also another run-up. There were a lot of movie directors who Universal, as like a movie studio or company, had like, who, like these certain movie directors Universal were like eyeing to do a remake of the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff Mummy movie. And every time they would like read a script of any of these directors' take or version or vision of a Mummy remake, Universal, like a bunch of bitches, thought, oh no, that's too dark, that's too bloody, that's too gory. So at the same time, I can kind of see and understand why Stephen Sommers went for a lower rating, which is pathetic. And it just enrages me that Universal had to be just such a bunch of pussies back then in the 90s by turning so many just really interesting, fascinating, unique, dark, violent, horrifying, disturbing, twisted, sickening takes on a Mummy remake, which I would have loved to see. I would have been so very excited to see any of those directors' takes on a Mummy remake, whether that would have been Clive Barker, George A. Romero, Joe Dante, or whoever else was also like eyed to do a Mummy remake before it ultimately landed to Stephen Sommers. Also, originally, Universal was planning to do like lower budget horror monster movie remakes. Like originally they were only going to do like a budget of like, I think it was 10 million, and this was back in like the early to mid 90s, and they were going to start with The Mummy, which if anything is probably one of the most popular monsters out of like any of the Universal monsters, like any of the other ones, I mean. And, you know, Universal would have saved way more money if they still would have gone in that direction and would have stuck to their original like idea or plan, if you will. But Universal, like a bunch of sissies, just thought, oh no, all these takes are too dark. And then when it landed to Stephen Sommers and they loved his idea, they bumped his budget up to 80 million. And it's just ridiculous. And it's just unfair to all those other movie directors who had way more awesome, superior visions or takes or ideas on a Mummy remake that would have actually been a horror spiritual successor to the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff Mummy movie. But Universal had to turn them all down. So many movie directors, so many talented, gifted movie directors all got turned down, all got the boot, all got refused because their take or their ideas or their visions or versions or script or whatever of their Mummy remake was too violent, too dark or whatever. And it just goes to show how much of a bunch of pussies that Universal is, either at the time in the early to mid 90s or maybe even still now. Maybe they still haven't learned from their mistake. And what sucks massive balls is the fact that even now, they still hardly have remade that many of their monster movies. I mean, let's face it. And there's no question about it. Like, they still haven't done a remake of like Frankenstein or the Swamp Thing. I think it's called the Swamp Thing, or Frankenstein's Bride, or the Bride of Frankenstein, or something like that. And then I mean, there's just so many original black and white Universal monster movies that even now that were in the 2020s, that Universal still has failed to remake. I mean, they sort of kind of remade The Mummy, whatever, which I feel is kind of overrated. Even though I love that movie, I would have much rather preferred a actual horrifying horror spiritual successor to the original 1932 black and white Boris Karloff version. And they sort of kind of remade The Wolfman, which I thought was a pretty dope movie. And sadly, that movie had a high budget of, I think it was like 100 million or even 150 million. And they didn't even get back what they used to make the movie. Like the director and producer and all the people who were working on The Wolfman from 2010 with Benicio del Toro, who played the Wolfman, they spent like 100 or 150 million. It was a big ass budget movie, especially for like 2010, and they didn't even make back half that money. Well, I mean, okay, so they made back more than half, but what I meant was they didn't make back even as much as they spent on making that movie, which is really tragic. And, you know, what's sad about The Wolfman 2 is I remember reading an article about how The Wolfman was actually supposed to be not just a reboot or remake of The Wolfman, but also it was supposed to be like a series of remakes for the classic Universal monsters. And it was going to start with Wolfman and then like continue from there on. But of course, because that movie flopped, that didn't end up happening. And I still love that movie. You know, don't get me wrong. I own that movie. And I'm heartbroken that movie wasn't able to start the reboot for the other Universal monster movies. And then also, like, they did remake The Invisible Man, which I thought was a really good movie. And it was a low budget, which was good. But even that movie still, like, it hasn't really sparked or greenlit any other, like, Universal monster movie, like, reboots or remakes, in other words. But anyways, so in the original like version or script of even Stephen Sommers' Mummy movie, even the original version of his was going to be much more darker and brutal and violent and whatnot, increased blood, gore, and obviously would have received a higher rating. And, you know, one of the things that at least I remember is that during Emotep's mummification, he was going to have, like, Stephen Sommers was going to have a scene where they actually show the embalmers or whatever they were called actually cutting off his tongue and throwing it to dogs to like eat or whatever. But a tongue isn't even that long, but that would have still either way been pretty disturbing. And there was also going to be a more horrifying scene of when the scarab beetles were put on Emotep after he was like wrapped in the linen or whatever, where they were going to be like crawling in his mouth and up his nose, and that he was going to like have to force like eating them because they were cursed beetles. They were cursed scarab beetles in the original script of The Mummy, where part of Emotep's curse was where he was going to have to forcibly eat them or swallow them or whatever and go up his nose. And that shit would have been disturbing as fuck. And also like there was like an extended prologue for Emotep and An Ox and a Moon, like an extended take on that, which I would have loved seeing. And I mean, there was going to be like scenes where it would have actually showed the mummy ripping out Mr. Burns' tongue and eyes to put in his mummified body so that he could have had a tongue and eyes again to start like regenerating himself. And I mean, the original script, again, I can't remember everything, but that's why I highly suggest you all go and read the article right after watching this video. And again, I will put the link in the description below and pin the comment to the top of the Screen Rant article that is called Everything That Was Changed from the Original Script of the 1999 Mummy movie or whatever. And just please read it. I beg of you, please read it, because you won't be let down. And, you know, again, I don't know, I'm really disappointed and upset that Stephen Sommers couldn't have gone with his original script. And again, at the same time, I can see why he didn't. Because I know if he would have, Universal would have turned him down. They would have rejected him just like they rejected all those other movie directors. Because for whatever bullshit reason, Universal, you know, they didn't want too much of a dark take on the Mummy remake. Like, they wanted a horror Mummy movie, but they didn't want it to be too dark. They didn't want it to be too violent or too bloody or too gory or whatever. And it's just so annoying. And I guess they also thought that people at the time during that era of the 1990s would have probably hated it or not loved it or whatever. I don't know. It's just pathetic. It really is. And I mean, what can you do though? You can't change the past. And you know, I'm just mad as hell because, you know, I'm an old guy here. Like, at least I feel old for my age. I'm 25, almost 26 years old, and there are so many movies that I would have loved being out and like an actual spiritual successor to the 1932 black and white Boris Karloff Mummy in the late 1990s or early to mid 1990s or whatever. I mean, I'm really let down about that, as well as the fact that a lot of the other classic Universal monsters didn't yet get rebooted or remade in modern times. It just sucks. And this is all Universal's fault. Universal has nobody else to blame but themselves. And then, of course, they tried to do the stupid ass bullshit Universal Monsters Universe. And it's like, bro, that shit failed before it even started. And, you know, one grave mistake they made was by hiring Tom Cruise, who kept changing the fucking script. And he wanted most of the movie to be about his character. So the director who directed the 2017 Mummy remake or reboot, he should have never cast Tom Cruise. Either he should have cast like Channing Tatum or Chris Pratt even. And I would have personally gone with Chris Pratt, at least in my opinion, or some other like new upcoming actor, like some kind of humble, meek actor who wouldn't have tried changing the script over and over and over and like being all selfish and greedy, self-centered and self-absorbed and wanting like most of the movie to be about his character, which is ridiculous and just outrageous like Tom Cruise did. And that's the reason that movie flopped, is mainly thanks to Tom Cruise. It wasn't really because the movie itself was bad. It was because of Tom Cruise's dumbass by wanting to make most of the movie about his stupid bitch-ass character. But again, what can you do? And you, of course, Universal wasted a bunch of money on that. How unfortunate. But anyways, let me know what you all think in the comment section down below. I'm out.